Hi, and welcome to Hardcore Current Affairs. This episode is about the Chinese foreign policy. It's divided into 8 sections. First, an introduction, followed by the history, crisis, organizations, Belt Road Initiative, the South China Sea, cyber and internet, and trade. There are timestamps in the description of this video for these sections and a list of sources. Currently 4 principal forces shape Chinese actions in the world: domestic politics and other internal constraints, global interdependence, realist foreign policy thinking, and technology-driven action-reaction dynamics. China's foreign policy, Deng Xiaoping said, consists of opposing hegemony, protecting world peace, and strengthening unity and cooperation with the Third World. The highest priority is to maintain the dictatorial and near totalitarian control of the Communist Party of China, modernize China as the most powerful country in the world, and to seize the island of Taiwan. The Communist Party has identified the constitutional democracy, civil society, and Western concepts of a free and open press as dangerous ideas that must be opposed at all costs. Chinese leaders, both political and military, have revealed the goal is twofold: to restore what communist leaders believe is China's rightful dominant place as the leader of the world, and to destroy the United States of America and the European Union. China has reverted to its Maoist communist roots and has become more a repressive dictatorship domestically as it seeks world domination abroad. In the past 30 years, Chinese foreign policy has reversed from avoidance to embracing multilateralism and international organizations. China is becoming increasingly dominated by international agreements, rules, and regimes. China's new foreign policy is characterized by money politics, military diplomacy, and a new assertiveness in international relations. China is willing to use its financial capabilities and investment programs to establish and support diplomatic relations with strategically relevant states. China further uses its military to bolster its partners through joint exercises, the supply of weapon systems, or the creation of joint anti-terror organizations for border control purposes. China's new foreign policy is characterized by a new assertive stance, visible in policies in the South China Sea, territorial disputes, the creation of the Asian Infrastructure Bank, and many others, as we shall see. China's foreign policy is, in contrast to Western practices, a coherent unity. China is even ready to defend globalization against the threats of protectionism and isolationism emerging in the West. Speaking at the APEC summit in 2016, Xi Jinping stated, "Sealing off and excluding others is not the correct choice. China will not shut the door to the outside world but open it more. We're going to ensure the fruits of development are shared." Further, Xi Jinping became the first Chinese president to travel to the center of globalization, the World Economic Forum's annual gathering in Davos, Switzerland, and deliver yet another rousing defense of globalization. China is the largest trading power in the world. Tens of millions of Chinese travel abroad annually, and of the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, it deploys the largest number of peacekeeping troops in the world. In the last 20 years, China has been one of the world's top receivers of foreign direct investment, welcomed foreign universities and NGOs to assist in the country's development, and sent as many as 500,000 students to study abroad every year. China's military is also expanding its domain. It has established its first logistic base in Africa, enabling its military for the first time to boast a global presence. And Beijing is developing ports in strategic regions that serve not only commercial but also security interests. In addition, Xi Jinping initiatives such as the Belt Road Initiative, the Free Trade Area of the Asia-Pacific, and the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank extend well beyond the Asia-Pacific region and establish China as a creator of new institutions that promote a more globalized and integrated world through lower tariff barriers for trade and greater ease of investment. The current Chinese leadership has also assumed a greater role in organizations such as the IMF and hosted the G20. John King Fairbank, the Harvard historian, noted in 1948 that to understand Chinese leaders, historical perspective is not a luxury but a necessity. Chinese leaders and the public today are often reminded that only the Chinese Communist Party was able to save China and end the century of humiliation. The Korean War and the tussle with the Soviet Union, the Cultural Revolution and Tiananmen Square, the Taiwan crisis, they're all burned in on the Chinese official mind. And behind them there are lessons of a farther past, of opium wars and the warlord area, reminders of how complacency in a dangerous world can lead to dismemberment and despair. Hatred in Chinese society stems from the humiliation and that conquest and colonization were for China. China has been obsessed with enforcing its territorial integrity very strictly. China's government has since 1949 been dominated by the Chinese Communist Party, with Marxism-Leninism by Chinese characteristics as the guiding ideology. China's peaceful development grand strategy started with Deng Xiaoping's foreign policy that was influenced by Xu Enlai had described as peaceful coexistence in the non-alignment movement at the Bandung Conference in the mid-1950s. China's strong emphasis on territorial integrity, sovereignty, and non-interference of one country in another's internal affairs has been a trademark of its foreign policy approach, as well as an important factor in its peaceful development grand strategy. In upholding this norm, the golden rule in the law of nations, it was a surprise that China took the side of Russia when Crimea joined the Russian Federation. China's reaction to this incident is a major divergence from its grand strategy. When China began engaging the United States in the 1980s, the strategy of Beijing's rulers was characterized as heavily borrowed from Deng Xiaoping's foreign policy, which is to conceal one's capacity and bide one's time, keep a low profile. The key internationally of this grand strategy is to defend Chinese territorial integrity, reunifying China and resolving territorial disputes. China's profile in international relations underwent a decisive change in the aftermath of the Tiananmen Square incidents of 1989 and the Taiwan Strait crisis of 1995-96. China's resulting isolation further intensified perceptions of the country as a rising global power that did not fit into the existing system of international institutions and posed a potential threat to its Asian neighbors. China has become increasingly active in multilateral fora and following its successful applications for access to international institutions, such as the International Monetary Fund and the World Trade Organization, China has expanded its relations with the global system, benefiting both its economy and its reputation. In the first decade of the new millennium, China was treated as a responsible stakeholder of the established Western-style international system. Starting in 2003, Chinese officials began talking about creating national champions, which referred to a secret plan to subsidize 50 Chinese firms so they would earn a place on the Fortune Global 500 list by 2010. They achieved this goal. During the Hu Jintao administration from 2003 to 12, China began to adopt the principle of an all-around, all-directional foreign policy that theoretically does not differentiate among geographical regions or countries. Chinese foreign policy is not about relationship with a particular region or country. China emphasizes balanced diplomacy and seeks to develop ties with all important powers in the world. Big powers are the key. China's periphery is the priority. Developing countries are the foundation. Multilateral platforms are the stage. In the past decade, 2 successive Chinese presidents have hinted at Chinese intentions. In September 2005, President Hu Jintao delivered a speech at the UN General Assembly titled "Build Towards a Harmonious World of Lasting Peace and Common Prosperity," in which he discussed the idea of a harmonious world. In the speech, Hu said, "Let us join hands and work together to build a harmonious world with lasting peace and prosperity." 8 years later, his successor, Xi Jinping, provided a major clue to the world's future in just 5 words of his keynote speech. Development is of overriding importance, adding later that we must constantly tempt the material and cultural foundations for the realization of the Chinese dream. China has begun to take a more proactive approach than before, partly to the Chinese perception since the 2008 global financial crisis that China's time may now have come because the crisis originated in the United States and China was not too deeply impacted by it. One example is the fact that China will not engage in foreign relations with a country that does not accept Tibet and Taiwan as inherent parts of China's territory. Again, the century of humiliation explains why the Chinese are obsessed with issues regarding sovereignty, national unification, and territorial integrity. By 2019, under Xi Jinping, China again signaled this decisive end to its more than quarter-century-old guidance to hide your capabilities and bide your time, as he issued a series of new foreign affairs and military policy directives, calling on China to uncompromisingly defend its interests and actively promote changes to international order. On the international level, the Xi government has developed numerous foreign policy initiatives ranging from enhanced state-to-state relations to the ambitious Belt and Road initiatives. Trade networks set to expand into Africa, Asia, Eurasia, Europe, Central America and Russia, and to other regions. China's foreign policy expansion under President Xi has taken place in tandem with rapid development of Chinese economic power. President Xi was laying out the goal of harmonizing the world according to Chinese values. Without the proper context, the words of Hu and President Xi seem innocuous, but China's notion of harmony in the field of geopolitics means unipolar dominance, and the Chinese dream is for China to be the world's only superpower, unrivaled economically, militarily, and culturally by 2049. In 2010, a top-secret briefing given to Chinese officials by a foreign affairs expert of the Central Committee answered the question, "What is the most important foreign policy challenge our nation faces in the next decade?" According to the notes obtained by the US government, the expert's answer was how to achieve the decline of the United States. There is fear of the spread of the American model of free market economics and elections. Yet it is okay to study science, business management and other politically safe subjects by going to school in the United States, as roughly 250,000 Chinese students do today. Both former President Hu and then Premier Wen Xiaobao made multiple trips to many parts of the world to promote mutual cooperation, trade and dialogue. This Chinese charm offensive has been emulated by President Xi and Premier Li Keqiang. China has been sensitive to perceived slights and their diplomatic practice is becoming increasingly aggressive. Examples include protests against Japan over historical grievances, Norway over the 2010 Nobel Prize incident, South Korea over regional anti-missile technology cooperation with the United States, and Canada in late 2018 over the detainment of a top executive from Huawei, a major Chinese telecommunications firm. Further, China fights with India, and there are many more examples from Vietnam, the Philippines, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, France, Canada, Sweden, Taiwan, and Denmark. China, in result, threatens national states to censorship, alter course, or with economic sanctions. These practices are in stark contrast to the panda diplomacy, which is China's use of giant pandas as diplomatic gifts to other countries. The practice existed as far back as the Tang dynasty, when Empress Wu Zetian sent a pair of pandas to Emperor Tenmu of Japan in the year 685. As of 2019, there are 27 zoos in 21 countries outside of mainland China who have pandas. Tensions in East Asia are at the highest point they have been since World War II. China's destruction of its weather satellite in 2007 was the first in a series of warning shots, intentional provocations and hostilities designed to test the resolve of the United States and allied nations, and the boundaries of what is deemed acceptable by international norms. The incidents have become steadily more bold since 2007. In December 2009, President Obama traveled to Copenhagen in Denmark, where representatives from 192 countries had gathered to ratify new global policies on climate change. This summit was marked by a significant change in the public tone of Chinese officials. They demonstrated uncharacteristic rudeness, interrupting Western diplomats on several occasions and providing little constructive input to the discussions. Premier Wen Xiaobao disregarded the other heads of government by refusing to attend most of the negotiations. China conducted its first joint military exercises with a foreign army in October 1999. During the Russia-Pacific Fleet's visit to China, it conducted joint naval exercises with the PLAN's Eastern Fleet. The exercises took place in the East China Sea near Shanghai and were limited both as regards the weapon systems involved and the scope of the exercises. In 2001, the two armies conducted military exercises using Russian strategic bombers, and in 2005, together with the members of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, China and Russia carried out a military exercise called Peace Mission 2005 on China's Shandong Peninsula in the vicinity of two Koreas. The exercise combined air, sea and ground forces. China's military budget has at least tripled over the last 15 years, causing more than a few raised eyebrows in the region. For many years, China has sold missile technology to rogue states that develop weapons of mass destruction, act aggressively toward their neighbors, arm terrorists and oppress their own people. Their clients have included Iran, Libya and Syria. During 1990 to 2014, China upgraded and modernized its armed forces. Foreign arms purchases are reported to amount to $40.6 billion. Given the huge size of the army, the number of weapons purchases still only have a modest impact on transforming Chinese forces into a modern and capable army. In comparison, India purchased weapons for $52.6, and that's in the same period from 1990 to 2014. China increasingly offers an alternative to Western institutions in the international relations and global system. The Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank as an alternative to World Bank loans. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization as an alternative to the NATO security architecture, or the Chiang Mai initiatives as an Asian financial institution and an alternative to the IMF. China is establishing international institutions according to its own strategic goals and thus incrementally creating alternatives to Western-designed international institutions. The core of China's new foreign policy is its concept of itself as a superpower on par with the USA. The Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or ASEAN, has become the accepted diplomatic channel for both China and the Southeast Asian nations. ASEAN therefore offers opportunities for Western policymakers to engage China through the related Asian Regional Forum for Security Discussions, or APEC for economic issues. Economic cooperation is undoubtedly the area in which China's foreign policy relations have experienced the most progress. China and ASEAN trade has increasingly dramatically since the 1990s, and with the establishment of the ASEAN China Free Trade Area, future trade growth is promising. China's occupation of the Mischief Reef in 1995 was the first occupation of an island claimed by the ASEAN member states. The incident heightened the suspicions of ASEAN member states claimants over the South China Sea disputes, and in March 1995 the ASEAN foreign ministers reached agreement on a united condemnation of Chinese occupation of the Mischief Reef. In 1996, the then Malaysian Defense Minister Said Hamid Al-Bah stated in regard to the China threat theory that we in Southeast Asia generally feel that China has so far been a sober and responsible regional player. Beijing has sought to stress its great power role in the Asia-Pacific, with one notorious example being a flustered statement by then Chinese Foreign Minister Yang Jiechi at an ASEAN meeting in July 2010, start of quote, "China is a big country and other countries are small countries, and that's just a fact," end of quote. At present, unlike in previous decades, the possibility of a border war or regional conflict involving China, despite the still shaky security situation in the South China Sea, remains. Until 1971, China was shut out of the United Nations, and thus Beijing tended to view UN efforts as tools of the great powers, an impression not helped by the Korean War. China's activities within the UN have become more unilateral since the 1990s. Beijing made use of the veto in the United Nations Security Council to block two peacekeeping initiatives, one for Guatemala in 1997 and one for Macedonia in 1999. In both cases, the states at the time were recognizing Taiwan. Beijing, along with Russia, vetoed a January 2007 UN resolution criticizing Myanmar for its human rights violations, and both states implemented a similar UN Security Council veto in July 2008, which would have punished the then government of Robert Mugabe in Zimbabwe and blackmailed Greece into blocking the European Union's criticism at the United Nations of China's human rights records. In the case of post-2011 conflict in Syria, China frequently used the double veto, casting a dissenting vote together with Russia during Western-backed condemnations of the actions of the Bashar al-Assad government during the conflict. The last such double veto was in February 2017, when Beijing and Moscow vetoed a US-backed resolution which would have placed international sanctions on the Assad regime for its use of chemical weapons. When a March 2014 UN Security Council resolution, which criticized the Russian-backed secession referendum in Ukraine's occupied Crimea region, was multilateralism brought to a vote. Russia predictably issued a veto, but China opted instead to abstain, not only reflecting Beijing's concerns about Russian-backed military activities in Crimea and eastern Ukraine, but also that China was seeking to avoid the appearance of a direct opposition to Moscow's actions. China issued its first veto in 1972, shortly after successfully obtaining its UN Security Council seat from the Republic of China, Taiwan that is, the previous year. And the reason for the veto was opposition to the new country of Bangladesh receiving its UN membership, which is a reflection of the close relationship between China and Pakistan, which also opposed what was then East Pakistan becoming a separate state. Since that time, China's early uses of the UN Security Council veto, which is 8 times between 1972 and early 2012, had been far less frequent than those of the other 4 permanent members of the UN Security Council. As well, Beijing has occasionally offered suggestions as how the UN Security Council could be reformed to better reflect the post-Cold War system, while Beijing had offered support for the possible inclusion of Brazil and Germany as permanent UN Security Council members. Regional political rivalries in Asia are seen to have influenced the lack of Chinese support for either India or Japan getting such status. Beijing currently appears to be translating its increased foreign policy interests into a much more activist position in the United Nations, including in the areas of peacekeeping and addressing civil conflicts. From a regional viewpoint, while Beijing has long accepted the idea that some security issues are better addressed on a multilateral level, China, like other states in the Asia-Pacific, has had to approach security problems in a region with still underdeveloped strategic regimes. There is no equivalent of a NATO or an Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe in the Pacific Rim, and there is little sign that such a configuration will come about given the political differences between the 2 largest states in the region, China and Japan, and concerns among many other Asian governments about acceding to a security agreement with the same level of formality as a NATO-type grouping. The ASEAN Regional Forum is a good example of this. China agreed to join the ARF when it was created under ASEAN's auspices in 1994. The ARF is a large-scale security community with 27 members, which addresses regional strategic problems. However, unlike NATO, it lacks an enforcement mechanism and remains largely a consultative body rather than a defense pact. In 2001, China and several other countries developed an organization that they viewed as a potential counter to NATO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. The SCO's members are China, India, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Russia, Pakistan, Tajikistan and Uzbekistan, and 4 observer states interested in acceding to full membership, which are Afghanistan, Belarus, Iran and Mongolia, and 6 dialogue partners in the same region. The SCO, however, goes beyond NATO's simply security cooperation and includes mechanism for collaboration on trade, finance and legal matters. The biggest difference between the SCO and NATO is the nature of the governments of its members. NATO is an alliance of 28 democracies, while the SCO is essentially a coalition of autocracies, except India, which is democratic. Following the resolution of all outstanding border issues between Beijing and the bordering post-Soviet states, by the turn of the new century, the SCO's focus shifted from combating what it termed the 3 evil forces of terrorism, secessionism and extremism in Eurasia. Its members have the economic influence to undermine any global institution simply by not participating in it or by not abiding to its decisions. China is making selective and strategic use of international organizations through engagement in order to advance its power and capabilities in the international system, to develop an identity as a responsible stakeholder in the international system, and to move towards developing as a great and perhaps global power. Beijing is now much more willing and able to develop and support newer institutions which may counter traditional Western ones, such as the New Development Bank, formerly referred to as the BRICS Development Bank, and the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. China's views on current multilateral intervention are that such operations are best undertaken via the UN and within the boundaries of international law. Both the NATO operations in Yugoslavia and the US-led Iraq intervention were criticized by China for going outside of the United Nations mandates, and the country has been resistant to the use of force both in the Iran and the North Korea cases, and was highly critical of the NATO involvement in Libya during the civil war in 2011, which resulted in the fall of Gaddafi's regime, but destabilized the country to the point where fighting erupted again in 2014, and has been against UN armed intervention in the civil war in Syria ever since it started in 2011. However, Beijing since the turn of the century has been more enthusiastic about engaging in UN peacekeeping missions. For example, China was supportive of the UN peacekeeping missions in Cambodia from 91 to 93 and East Timor from 2002 to 12, even though both missions in theory set a precedent regarding interference in another state's internal security affairs. This view stood in marked contrast to Beijing's hostility over military intervention in Kosovo in 1999, which bypassed the UN and was conducted under the leadership of NATO. China has also supplied observers and troops to UN peacekeeping missions, including in Cambodia, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Lebanon, Liberia, Mali, South Sudan, Timor-Leste, and Western Sahara. China also deployed UN personnel to Haiti, despite the fact that Haiti recognizes Taiwan. 8 Chinese UN personnel lost their lives and were honored as martyrs by Beijing in the aftermath of the January 2010 earthquake in Haiti. And since that time, there has also been Chinese peacekeeper casualties both in Mali and South Sudan. China has changed its views on peacekeeping though, since the end of the Cold War. Chinese participation in all UN debates and activities on peacekeeping issues have been more active. It has also tried to influence the process of decision-making regarding UN operations. The Chinese delegations to the UN has consistently affirmed the government's position that China attaches great importance to the success of peacekeeping operations. David Shambaugh, writing in the Wall Street Journal in June 2015, bemoaned the negative trajectory of the Sino and American relationship and noted that the long string of issues, including security, cybersecurity, human rights and legal differences, and economic concerns, were contributing to the difficult diplomatic atmosphere. He concluded that this is simply the new normal, and both sides had better get used to it, rather than naively professing a harmonious relationship that is simply not achievable. The Asian Silk Road connected Asia, Africa and Europe. It was established during the Han Dynasty. For more than 1,000 years, these trade networks transported goods, ideas, beliefs and cultures across continents. This project is General Secretary Xi Jinping's signature economic and foreign policy initiative, and it has been written into the Chinese constitution. Beijing is now spending between 1 and 3 trillion US dollars, some estimates as high as 8 trillion, on the Belt Road Initiative, which results in large-scale debt on poor countries. The debt-ridden states are becoming global military bases for power projection. The Belt and Road Initiative aims to use China's economic power to build roads, airports and railroads as a means of expanding power and influence, and Xi Jinping's personal notion of the China Dream, which is China must become a superpower by or before 2050. The new Silk Road project bolsters Chinese exports and provides a huge government grant to China's construction industry, since Chinese companies in particular will benefit from infrastructure projects in Central Asia. The new Silk Road project is a security program that will stabilize China's insurgent neighborhood, that is Xinjiang and unstable neighborhoods. The realization of the mainland part is much more difficult and politically delicate than interference by outside powers, is highly unwelcome by the Chinese standpoint. For the maritime part of this project, free passage along the important seaways is China's goal. The establishment of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank at the end of 2015 and the Silk Road Fund established at the end of 2014 with $40 billion US contribution from China signify an intensified approach to reanimating the old trade routes. Both institutions are specifically designed to fund and thus facilitate infrastructure projects of the One Belt, One Road project, also called the New Silk Road. This infrastructure project is meant to intensify China and Europe trade, as well as China's trade with other countries along these trade routes, which is both in Central Asia and along the sea routes. The primary phase of the Belt and Road initiatives includes 3 main components: the land-based Silk Road Economic Belt, a sea-based 21st century maritime Silk Road, and a worldwide digital Silk Road. In broad terms, the Silk Road Economic Belt Plan connects China with Central and South Asia, the Middle East and Europe. One of the most significant elements of this belt is the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, which spans from China's western Xinjiang region through the entire country of Pakistan. Political and security risks, financing difficulties, environmental concerns, and a lack of political trust between China and some host countries represent challenges for Beijing and have stalled some of the Belt and Road Initiative's most high-profile projects. The U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission said in their 2018 report that problems have been reported in 66 countries for approximately 270 of the 1,814 Chinese infrastructure projects, which were then announced since 2013. 32% of the total value of these projects have reported difficulties. In Malaysia, the Prime Minister in 2018 criticized the Belt and Road as a new version of colonialism and suspended tens of billions of dollars of Chinese-backed projects pending review. In Sri Lanka, massive numbers of citizens protested the Sri Lankan government ceding control of a port in Hambantota to pay off debts to China. A report by the Center for Global Development warned that China's 8 trillion Belt and Road Initiative involves 68 nations in projects involving transportation, energy, telecommunications infrastructure development. 23 of those countries are facing debt distress from participation, including 8 nations that face high or significant risk as a result of their indebtedness to Chinese state-owned banks. The countries include Djibouti, Kyrgyzstan, Laos, Maldives, Mongolia, Montenegro, Pakistan and Tajikistan. Projects around the world are also failing due to lack of capital. In 2015, media reports suggested that the Nicaragua Canal, financed by Wang Qing, a Chinese billionaire, which would compete with the Panama Canal, would be delayed and possibly cancelled because Wang's personal wealth declined greatly as a result of the 2015 and 16 Chinese stock market crash. With regard to credit extended to foreigners, the investment in Pakistani infrastructure, the loans to Venezuela, the money being poured into the One Belt One Road Fund, these are not the types of debts that historically are repaid. China has even now sued Venezuela in an American court in hope of recovering its loans. China claims most of the South China Sea, including all of the Parcel and Spratly Islands as depicted in its famous U-shaped or 9-dashed lines map. China's claims is based on discovery on the Spratly Islands. Chinese jurisdiction subsequently exercised over them for more than 1,000 years. Expeditions led by Admiral Cheng Ho during the Ming Dynasty in the 15th century sent to the Spratlys and the Paracels, and the fact that the islands have been referred to in maps and records for up to the 17th century. In international law, claims based on historical rights are not considered promising. Nonetheless, in 1994, a study conducted by 400 Chinese scholars over 10 years of research was completed, which proved historically that China discovered and developed the Spratly Islands. In Asia's diplomatic history, there has never been such a precedent as the coexisting of a strong China and a strong Japan. In the East China Sea, a series of rocks stretching westward from China's archipelago had become the site for skirmishes that could develop into full-scale naval battles. On September 7 in 2010, a Chinese fishing boat collided with Japanese patrol vessels near the disputed islands known as Jiaoju or Senkaku. The Chinese boat's captain and his crew were detained by the Japanese Coast Guard and taken to Japan over the Chinese government's strenuous objections. In response, China blocked a number of rare earth exports to Japan and arrested 4 Japanese nationals for allegedly trespassing in restricted Chinese military areas. 2 years later, 6 Chinese maritime surveillance vessels in 2 fleets sailed into the Senkaku or Jiaoju Island region, overwhelming any Japanese efforts to pursue them. The patrol followed the Chinese announcement of an expansion of its territorial waters to encompass the islands. To demonize Japan, China has sent the message that it regards Japan's wealth and its position as America's main ally in Asia as products of ill-gotten gains from World War II. This is called a phenomenon of virulent new form of state-sanctioned anti-Japanese nationalism. Nations in the Confucian zone of civilization are supposed to accept China's natural leadership, not attempt to resurrect old empires or align with a foreign hegemon, such as the United States. After reclaiming 3,200 acres of new islands, China deployed advanced anti-ship and anti-aircraft missiles on the island in what the CIA described as China's Crimea, a stealth takeover similar to the Russian annexation of Ukraine's peninsula in 2014. According to the official Chinese Arctic policy, respect should be mutual. It means all states should abide by international treaties, such as the UN Charter and the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, as well as general international law. China has demonstrated a willingness to ignore international law by rejecting the ruling it received regarding its sovereignty claims in the South China Sea at the Permanent Court of Arbitration. The China that has emerged under Xi Jinping embraces globalization, but only to the extent it controls the flow of ideas, as well as human and financial capital. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton drew angry reactions from China when she expressed America's desire to mediate the dispute between China and its southern neighbors. What followed were months of harassment of Vietnamese and Philippine vessels. The president of the Philippines, Benigno S. Aquino, likened the situation to that faced by Czechoslovakia in 1938. And he's quoted as saying, "At what point do you say enough is enough? Well, the world has to say it. Remember that Sudetenland was given in an attempt to appease Hitler to prevent World War II." End of quote. But it is with Japan that tensions are highest. Some Chinese authors regard the Japanese as a mongrel race and as a proxy to the United States in Asia. Resentment remains as well from Japan's brutal occupation of China during World War II, of course. The South China Sea, through military bases, port facilities and access agreements allowing Chinese naval and air forces to utilize overseas facilities. The examples include Sri Lanka, which in July 2017 signed a 99-year lease for the Hambantota port with a Chinese state-owned company. After defaulting on the loan, as explained above, China took over the modernized port facility. Similar deals were reached for ports in Piraeus in Greece, Myanmar, in Gyeonggi, Akyab and Mergui, Bangladesh in Chittagong, Pakistan in Gwadar and in Darwin, Australia. Especially unsettling in this regard are intelligence about a Chinese submarine base allegedly established in the Maldives. While China is upgrading its armed forces to secure its energy supply, it causes security concerns in the region with the weapon systems it considers defensive. China is about to establish a series of port partnerships in littoral states along the sea lanes connecting Africa and the Middle East with Northeast Asia. The military aspect of China's new foreign policy is worrisome for its neighbors, but it's symbolic. China's military remains far inferior to Western forces and can therefore not be interested in being engaged in any serious confrontation with the US or allies. Also, China is the single greatest beneficiary of the existing global system. The China and US trade relations and China and ASEAN Economic Cooperation are far too vital to be put at risk for the sake of a minor territorial dispute. China's occupations in the South China Sea are of very limited strategic value and highly symbolic in nature. Military clashes between China and other claimants to the territorial disputes are too costly and will therefore not likely escalate into real fighting. China's policymakers are socialized by and thus familiar with ancient Chinese tricks, strategies to overcome a more powerful opponent by smart utilization of one's own limited capabilities. At the heart of many ancient tricks is the use of deception and distraction to confuse the opponent about one's actual tactic, disguise one's true intentions, and thus gain a strategic advantage. It is therefore significant that China's recent activities in the South China Sea, that is, artificial enlargements of occupied islets, were initiated at a time when the declared strategic US pivot to Asia was losing momentum. China is still a nascent superpower, and we are currently witnessing the beginnings of its new foreign policy. Its foreign diplomacy was dominated by old, apparently eternal paradigms, the unquestionable unity of China, and its resulting positions on Tibet, Kashmir, Xinjiang, Taiwan. China's relations with Japan, China's perception of subordinate ASEAN states, and China's wary partnership with Russia. These eternal paradigms are being tested, and against the backdrop of economic difficulties, China's foreign policy is possibly ready to develop unprecedented flexibility, with a Chinese twist, in some of its unshakable principles. Chinese foreign policy, based on interest rather than historical principles, could, for example, result in a China and India reapproachment and flexible solutions to the protracted Himalayan border disputes. The realignment of China's foreign policy offers opportunities for Western states and organizations to cooperate and thus integrate China. If not, China will develop independent solutions. For example, its perceived insufficient influence in the World Bank resulted in the creation of the China-dominated the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. Another Chinese foreign policy element is called techno-nationalism, because many of China's current leaders have scientific and engineering backgrounds and therefore take a scientific approach to both domestic and foreign policy. Another announced initiative under Xi Jinping is called Made in China in 2025, which is a plan to dominate all advanced technologies in the world. Further, Chinese cyber theft is responsible for the greatest transfer of wealth in history. The Chinese Ministry of State Security used a hacking squad known as APT-10 to target US companies in the finance, telecommunications, consumer electronics and medical industries, as well as NASA and Department of Defense research laboratories, estimated to be as much as $600 billion annually in stolen technology and intellectual property. Companies often do not report theft of their technology because they are afraid of losing access to the Chinese market. Although there is a lot of writing about China and Africa, in 2012 China spent $3 billion in total foreign direct investment to Africa, which is less than 4% of China's total foreign direct investment, which is $77.2 billion globally. For China's foreign strategy, Africa is a means rather than an end. Africa does not present direct threats or challenges to China's national security. Due to the geographical distance, there is no territorial disputes either between China and Africa. African countries, other than the three who retain diplomatic relations with Taiwan, of course, generally do not support the efforts of Taiwan, Tibet, or Xinjiang in their pursuit of independence from China. Africa has little, if any, ideological interest in promoting democracy in China as well. The European Union has already been China's top trading partner for 10 years. The annual trade volume has exceeded $550 billion, and there have been over 5 million visits between the two sides each year. As of 2012, China's largest trading partners were the European Union, while the United States' annual trade volume with China was $484.7 billion. The Association of Southeast Nations, Hong Kong and Japan, with African countries far behind. Although Sino and African trade reached $198.4 billion in 2005, it constitutes only 5% of China's global trade, which is $3.867 trillion. China is now an indispensable part of the global economy, and its economic policies echo well beyond its borders or even the frontiers of the Pacific Rim. As the Chinese government has tied much of its legitimacy to its ability to continue the economic reform process in the country and further improve the living standards of its citizens, its ongoing ability to engage international markets